name's Maya Lester, and I'm co-hosting this with Michael O'Kane, Senior Partner of Peters & Peters and EuropeanSanctions.com. At the end of January last year, we hosted our last webinar at European Sanctions, which was on what next on sanctions if Russia invades. And as everyone working on sanctions since then knows from a policy or legal perspective, the world has gone completely sanctions mad since then. We thought it was a good time, while everyone is still constantly focused on Russia, to start thinking about possible futures and what we should all potentially be thinking about next on sanctions, which obviously very much follow the world stage. There is concern or speculation about what sanctions might look like if China were to take action in Taiwan, and including, of course, on to what extent we can learn from the Russia sanctions handbook or not. So I'm delighted to have invited to this webinar some incredibly experienced thinkers on this topic. Joining us are Cindy Yu, the assistant editor of The Spectator, presenter of the Spectator Chinese Whispers podcast, which is a fantastic resource and many fascinating articles on China and other topics in The Spectator. Also David Wolber, who's of counsel at Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher in Hong Kong, previously at Gibson in DC and New York. He took a 5-year break. I'm not sure break is the right way to describe it, but certainly from Gibson to serve as Global Financial Crime Legal Advisory at MUFG Financial Crime in New York and HSBC in Hong Kong. We also have Chloe Cina, who is the head of Global Sanctions Advisory at Deutsche Bank. Before that, a British government legal advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and head of UK sanctions at HSBC. So we are delighted. We have an hour. There is an opportunity to ask questions in writing in the questions box, which I'm hoping you will find on your screens. And there may be time at the end to ask questions too. So there should be 2 opportunities. The way we will run this is, I hope, as a lively conversation, starting with Cindy. So over to Michael to kick the questions off, please.
Maya, thank you very much. Cindy, we're delighted that you're able to join us this lunchtime. So before we get too stuck into the detail in relation to sanctions specifically, as far as China is concerned, perhaps you could just take a few moments to set the scene for all of us on what the current relations are like between the West and China.
It's a great question, Michael, and thank you so much for having me as well. I think that what we see disguised by the phrase the West is actually a lot of different opinions on China at the moment, that actually the West doesn't necessarily exist when it comes to approach to China. For understandable reasons, the view from DC, Washington is, the one that we here in London hear a lot, and also probably around the world as well. And it's clear that the US has a pretty hardline position on China at the moment, that Joe Biden hasn't changed much in terms of the actual substance of the US approach to China since Donald Trump. And if you put that on one side, then I guess on the other side, you've got people like Macron in France who want to actually have much more of an independent approach to China, much more pragmatic, and some people might say appeasing approach to China as well, just to say that you cannot ignore the world's second largest economy, you cannot even contain it, but you have to work with it, and actually you might get benefits from doing that as well. And I would say those are probably the 2 major poles in the West's approach to China, and in between there are all sorts of shades. I mean, the UK has flip-flopped, as people on this call will know, over the last 10 years, really. We haven't really known what to do with China, gone from the golden era to Liz Truss possibly declaring genocide in Xinjiang, and then now, as of last week, James Cleverly talking about this robust pragmatism. And I think the answer must be somewhere in the middle. We have to keep engaging with China, but we also have to be clear that security, we're moving into an era of history where security is becoming much more important than simply free trade compared to, say, the 90s. And then, of course, I think, there's heated rhetoric on top of that. You know, I think most politicians would say that we want to keep working with China. We know we've got to keep collaborating on things like climate change, all sorts of things, but not all politicians can achieve that given the rhetoric that they've used in the last few years. So when issues such as Xinjiang are brought up, you know, this moralistic approach makes it very, very difficult for a politician to walk back. How do you collaborate, or how do you work with a country that is, if you believe it, committing genocide? So that is the tricky part, that even if all politicians want to engage on some level, how do those with the fiercest rhetorics, with essentially Manichaean rhetoric on this, how do they approach going forward? And I think that's something that all countries are really kind of dealing with at the moment. And so I think it's very interesting times that we live in. And I would just say that, you know, it requires a lot of cool heads, as ever in international relations, but we're dealing, for the first time in modern history, the West is dealing with a rising China. So in some ways, this is an unprecedented challenge.
Yes, you talk about a rising China, and in particular, it's interesting to see China's influence in what most people would describe as sort of the developing world. There was an interesting quote I read recently from Larry Summers, who was quoting a senior official in a developing country who said that you know, what we get from China is an airport, what we get from the United States is a lecture. And the sort of, it seems as though the spinal cord of China's influence has been this Belt and Road Initiative that obviously has been going under Xi Jinping for some time. Is that? Would you say that was real, that initiative, and the relationships that have been forged, and how strong do you think those alliances are?
Great question. I don't think it's nearly as solid as it can seem, often portrayed in the media, or out of the fears, anxieties of Western politicians. If you look at the scheme itself, there was a really interesting report out recently that actually said that $78 billion of that money has been written off or renegotiated in the last 3 years. Now, depending on who you ask about the size of the project itself, that's somewhere, you know, around a quarter of the amount of loans that's been given out that has been actually written off. So I don't actually think it's a good investment on the side of Beijing to have committed to this. What happened was, clearly they thought they could buy friendships through this, and to some extent they have. If you look at the UN, for example, developing countries are much more likely to be supportive of China on various issues, even if it, you know, if they're a Muslim country and it's an issue impinging on the Xinjiang question, you know, they can still be supportive of the Beijing position there. And yet, at the same time, the Belt and Road Initiative has also given a lot of local politicians, opposition politicians, public opinion in these countries that are often less than democratic, a reason to say, to bash the existing government. You saw that in Thailand, for example, during COVID, the anti-government protests. One of the demands of the protesters was actually to not have the Chinese vaccine. So Thai protesters are taking it upon themselves to protest against having this closer relationship with China as part of their domestic political protest, which I thought was just a fascinating moment. So in some ways, the Belt and Road Initiative has actually turned some public opinion against Beijing. Now, that Larry Summers quote, I think, is fascinating, because I think what it reveals is, and I very much agree with it as well, what it reveals is a neo-colonialist view that I think the West still has when it comes to talking about the developing world. And what I mean by that is, too often in the narrative and the reporting around the Belt and Road Initiative about it being debt trap diplomacy, modern day colonialism, I personally see it as reflecting a Western colonial guilt, actually, that tries to see and project everything that other countries have done since empire and to try to fit it into that same box. And actually it's not exactly the same. And actually, I don't think that lens necessarily helps you illuminate as it does just help to mold your pre-existing opinions on it. And when it comes to these developing countries, you know, having said that, I don't think public opinion is swayed by it. Clearly a lot of authoritarian governments are. And for those authoritarian governments, they don't want a lecture. They don't want aid with strings about democratization or liberalization, especially if liberalization means opening up your economy to competition internationally at the time when actually having some protections for those nascent state champions might be a good thing. A lot of these countries don't get that from China. All they get is the money. And you can question how long-lasting these projects are, how useful, valid they are. But at the same time, for the local governments, they are often very welcome. But I think we just need to disaggregate who we're talking about when we're talking about this. You know, we're talking about the governments, often authoritarian governments. Are we talking about the opposition parties? We're talking about public opinion, all of these things. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative is much more complicated than simply some modern day colonialism.
So when it comes to considering sanctions in relation to China, a great deal of the focus now, increasingly filling up the opinion columns of newspapers and magazines, is around what may be happening in the future, the near, medium, or short, long-term future with China's relationship with Taiwan. I think Henry Kissinger has now said that we're in Cold War II, and so in terms of the United States relationship with China vis-a-vis the Taiwan situation, and the European relationship with China vis-a-vis the Taiwan situation, do you see differences emerging, and what's your assessment of sort of China's current position on this?
Well, I mean, clearly Macron muddied the waters a little bit when he visited China recently by pretty much suggesting that Taiwan was an internal issue. And that's the CCP line, really. So I think Beijing would have been quite pleased about that. But I think despite President Biden's gaffes, most of the time, the Chinese still see strategic ambiguity as the way that the US is treating the Taiwan issue. And let's be clear, it is the US that is the main major Western power whose opinions on Taiwan are important here. As much as Europe is important, it's simply not a Pacific power in the same way that the US is. And so strategic ambiguity, this policy that the US has had ever since recognizing communist China, is to say, basically, if you make a move on Taiwan, we're not really going to say what we're going to do. We could come into their defense, or we don't have to. And it's seen as a double deterrence. On the one hand, it deters the CCP from invading because they don't know to what extent resistance will be carried out by the US. But on the other hand, it deters the Taiwanese as well from declaring independence because they don't know if the Americans will come to their aid either. Now, I think that policy is still alive, as I say, despite President Biden's gaffes about coming to the aid of Taiwan. And I think it's very important to keep the Chinese guessing about the strength of American counter action, because otherwise, that's a very good deterrence in that situation. And I think even though President Macron has made very friendly noises there, as I say, the US is the Pacific power that China cares about the most when it comes to the Taiwan issue. It knows that actually probably the UK and France and Germany might be on the fence about defending Taiwan, but all of that, none of that almost matters as long as the US will still come to Taiwan's aid. So I think it's basically still a game of chicken at the moment.
Perfect. All right, that's wonderful scene setting. Thank you very much. Let me pass over to Maya now to deal with the more sort of sanctions related issues.
David, I suppose, is it fair to say the most significant sanctions on China so far are these US fairly significant controls on China's semiconductor industry, really from last year? And what impact do you think Western sanctions on China like that have had, if any, so far in China and Hong Kong?
Yeah, great question. And echo Cindy, thank you both for having me on this. And I think it's important that you started that question, Maya. When we talk about sanctions, sort of what do we mean by sanctions, right? I think that term gets used in two different ways. One is the broader context of what I would consider, all the various tools of economic statecraft, including export controls, import controls, traditional trade measures like tariffs, technology controls, and then, of course, not least, traditional sanctions, economic and financial sanctions of the type that's imposed by OFAC and the Department of the Treasury. When we look at that broad set of tools, I think by design so far, the focus and the impact that's been felt is in the export control space in a big way. And the export controls have increasingly become darling in Capitol Hill, particularly, I think, in the US-China context, because of the nature of the conflict and the sensitivities and the economic realities in the conflict. And the US-China conflict, I characterize really largely today as a technology-based conflict, also, a military capability conflict. But it's less of the tenor of a financial economic conflict in the sense of the US trying to ostracize China or major China corporates and financial institutions from the global system, like you have in a Syria or Iran or a Cuba, or even now a Russia context. And there's a lot of reasons why, which I think we'll get into that. I think in the export control space, we have seen some pretty significant impacts. I mean, we could argue all day about the extent of those, and folks can take issue with this, but you mentioned the semiconductor space. I do think that's probably the most significant action, and we're just now, starting to see the fallout of that across the supply chain, right? And we're going to continue to see that.
And so if China were to take action in Taiwan of some kind, what kinds of sanctions broadly do you think are likely to be imposed? I guess principally by the US, but also obviously the EU, UK and others would be watching. One of the things that I wonder about is, would this be likely to be targeted sanctions? Are we talking about lists of people around Xi Jinping, as we've seen around President Putin being targeted? If there are such lists, would Chinese military industrial complex entities in the US simply be added to an SDN list? Or are we talking more export controls? Any thinking being done on that?
A ton, sure. I mean, just to start, my view of the Taiwan situation is, were that to happen, and I actually am the view that it's unlikely China will initiate action against Taiwan in the coming years. I think there's so much downside for China right now and not a lot of upside, barring the US or potentially Taiwan forcing their hand. If they do, I think we're largely approaching a sort of Armageddon situation from a sanctions perspective. I mean, I think Cindy used the term, we're in unprecedented land. I think that's right. And I think it's, anything is on the table in that case. I think, yes, we would definitely see a ratcheting up of export controls. Probably anything touching the military would be verboten. I think you could see the limited sanctions that are in place. You mentioned the CMIX being, moved over to the SDN list, right? These companies that may have stronger connections to the Chinese military and the US eyes. But you could finally see some measure of targeting of the financial and economic sectors with your more traditional sanctions actions, which we haven't seen to date, right? There really aren't any US sanctions, significant US sanctions against China per se. And I think that may come as a bit of a surprise to some people that are listening to this today or on the recording. But if you look at the designations, the traditional sanctions designations the U.S. has put in place against China, it's very minor. There's a few hundred, maybe 400 plus SDNs in China. The vast majority of those have nothing to do with China per se. It's Iran, North Korea, nuclear weapons, drug trafficking, the same sort of SDNs you'll find in Europe. And in fact, there are more SDNs in Western Europe than there are in China. So, I think people put that in perspective. It's a very interesting stat that I don't think people are aware of when you're sort of looking at this holistically.
And can I just ask Chloe, from a sort of financial institutions perspective, do you share the same view on what might be likely to happen? And also, how nervous are banks, if that's the right word, about the Taiwan situation, and what steps right now are being taken to mitigate potential risk?
Thanks, Maya, and thanks to everybody else for the invitation. I think banks are nervous. Of course, banks were nervous before Russia, and a lot of preparation was done in advance of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think the key piece that was done then, and is also a part of banks' thinking now, is building that relationship with the regulators, not only for existing measures, but also forward thinking, and to gain that trust that I think traditionally, up until this invasion by Russia of Ukraine, that trust and that very close relationship, which has been nurtured over the past 12 months, didn't exist to the level that it does now. And that's helping the regulators think about what sanctions worked in the context of Russia, what sanctions may have the right sort of impact in terms of achieving their foreign policy objectives for China. think what banks are doing now is looking at a playbook, upskilling, resourcing to a degree that perhaps they had not previously thought would ever be imaginable, because they've seen that in a crisis like Russia, you really need to have boots on the ground and the right people that are in a position to be able to advise. In terms of sanctions, we've looked across the entire sanctions landscape. I think David set out some of the very key differences between export control measures and the traditional trade sanctions that we've seen. And you've talked about list-based sanctions as well. I think one of the things we've seen over the past year is a blurring of lines, and that is likely to continue as regulations take on new measures that perhaps would have been distinct in a separate legal instrument, but we're now seeing them combined in what would otherwise be a traditional sanctions regulation. I think capital markets restrictions is one thing on the agenda, as are list-based sanctions. You know, those members of the supervisory board that meet on a biannual basis as part of Xi's party will likely be targeted, including their family members and close associates. But that's not going to have the sort of impact that we have seen in Russia. It's far more likely to be of sort of punitive and deterrent value, as opposed to actually stopping any invasion of Taiwan. But I think the one thing I wanted to mention was about what the trigger would be. Is it going to be, a sanctions going to be triggered by an invasion, a quarantine, a blockade, or indeed, would it be the provision of lethal weapon by China to Russia? There are a number of different things going on at the moment geopolitically, and depending on what that trigger is, will impact the sort of sanctions we're likely to see.
Great, and I think we should definitely square back to Cindy for comments on a lot of this. I just wanted to ask one more thing, though, first to David and Chloe. I mean, and then really the same to Cindy. I mean, what serious thinking do you think is now being done insofar as resources allow on the pros and cons of serious ratcheting up of trade sanctions and export control on China? I mean, particularly China is a very different case from Russia in so many ways, a much bigger economy, more economic clout, query more vulnerable to sanctions in the tech and financial sectors, possibly than Russia has been in energy, but also the West is so hugely reliant on China for goods. Is it right? 50% of the world's trade currently passes through the Taiwan Straits. Is it realistic that there could be such a ratcheting up, given the potential for self-harm in the West? David, I don't know, reflection?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's the question, right, Maya? And that's, I think, the limiting factors. You know, the Chinese economy dwarfs the Russian economy and the importance of the global trade. I mean, you know, I think U.S. trade with Russia prior to the war was around $40 billion or something like that. U.S. trade with China is $650 billion, right? It's just astronomically larger. And I think, you know, Cindy mentioned sort of the difference between political rhetoric and the practicalities. And I think that's something to keep in mind. There's a lot of thinking going on in the Hill and in financial institutions and basically anybody operating in the region. But if you look at the political rhetoric, particularly rhetoric in Congress, in the US Congress, you know, I think there was 800 bills introduced last year that were anti-China in some way, because it's one of the only bipartisan issues where everybody wins right now in the US. So everybody wants to get a quick hit. But if you look at some of the policymakers and people that are on the ground on the economic side, like Janet Yellen and US Trade Rep Catherine Tai, both have said very recently that it is not the goal of the US to decouple from China. And in fact, that would be, quote, disastrous and impracticable. So I mean, I think there are real practical limits that when push comes to shove, that the US and its allies, of course, are very cognizant of. And sort of, I think barring, again, I like the way Chloe talked about this sort of scale of potential actions involving Taiwan. You know, I think barring the pull of an actual military invasion that brings the US into armed conflict with China, I think US regulators are going to be nervous to really put in place anything that looks like Russia at this point.
Michael, over to you at this point.
Well, I just wanted to go back to the issue. We're all in our daily working lives concerned about risk, and obviously the great risk here is that China is going to take some sort of action, and I know, Chloe, you mentioned about the provision of arms to Russia, but just focusing on Taiwan, whether it's a blockade or whether it's military action, certainly it does seem to be going through the motions. We saw this very recently when the Taiwanese premier went over to the United States and met McCarthy. And then there were, a whole scale of military exercises taking place in the Straits. So with your profound knowledge of the situation, Cindy, what's your take on whether or not you think China might take action in the, not necessarily the short term, but in the medium term? I mean, there is talk that Xi Jinping has made this sort of the centerpiece of his sort of legacy to bring Taiwan back into the fold and told his military to be ready by 2027. And a lot of US policymakers seem to be suggesting that this is probable now rather than possible. So I've heard David's view. What's your take?
Yeah, I think the medium term is harder to answer than the short term, because in the short term, I would say unlikely that they will take any action. But the medium term is really the crux of the question here. You're right to say that Xi Jinping himself has made this part of his legacy, his rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, this changes unseen in a century, and all of that clearly involves Taiwan. So Xi does want Taiwan back. The question is, how high a price is he willing to pay for it? And I think that, in the sanctions chat, the reverse, Maya, you asked about the self-harm element about sanctioning China. I think the reciprocal to that would be people in Beijing thinking, do we want to harm ourselves by invading Taiwan and triggering a set of actions? And I think, what the West has done in the wake of the Russian invasion has really shown more than expected unity in the eyes of Putin and Xi when it comes to how far the West is willing to pay a price in order to defend democracy. And I think that hasn't gone unnoticed. But, for the Chinese side, they'll be thinking, do we want to pay this price in order to get Taiwan back? And I mean, that is the question. I mean, I don't know, Michael, if I do have profound knowledge, because I think, so many analysts before the Russian invasion said this was not going to happen. And then it happened. So it really kind of falls on all of us foreign policy analysts to think, what were the shortfalls and what were the reasons why some people didn't see the invasion happening? So I wouldn't ever want to kind of predict that it's definitely not going to happen, because you cannot predict in the mind of an authoritarian, what they might wake up one day and think about. I will just, mention a few different points to consider, though, which is just that for one point, Xi Jinping is not a dictator in the same way that Putin is. Now, what I mean by that is that Chinese Communist Party has much more institutional power in China than Putin, than Xi has personal power. Whereas in Russia, Putin's power is pretty much absolute, and it's all about how he has a personal cult around him. Whereas in China, the Chinese Communist Party is 92 million members. It has come before Xi Jinping. It will last after Xi Jinping probably. So one man's madness is going to be a little bit more controlled, I would think, than Putin, who didn't even seem to have told many of his close allies about the invasion happening. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is the fact that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, doesn't seem to actually have the capability of taking Taiwan at the moment. Now, of course, it's going through rapid modernization and increases in funding, but we've got to bear in mind that Taiwan is not Ukraine in the sense that it is an island. What we're talking about here is a joint operation, an amphibious landing, which is incredibly difficult. If you think back to Dunkirk, for example, it's not clear that the PLA has that capability. Again, Michael, this is why your question is so tricky, because in the medium term, maybe they will. And if they can take Taiwan in a matter of days, then without, triggering, then the chances of triggering massive sanctions, I think, would be less, because, the more drawn out the conflict, the more time it gives the West to kind of get together, think about these conflicts, argue it out, and so on. But if in the future the PLA can take Taiwan in a matter of days, then I think that changes calculus. But it's important to know that it can't at the moment. And then the other thing to say is just the economics of the whole thing. This year, at least, China is coming out of its zero COVID rut. It's not looking like China might be talking about 3-4% growth for the rest of the decade, maybe not more than that, which is a massive drop from what happened pre-COVID and even, before then. So does the country really want to take that economic hit of invading another country? I'm just not 100% sure that will be such a clear-cut thing. And in the way that public opinion and politicians talk about Taiwan almost an inevitability that it will be invaded, I'm just not sure that is true, actually. So that's my lots of different things to consider answer, Michael, but no clear answer here.
And sorry to jump in. I just wanted to dovetail on something that's you saying. That's because I didn't want to come across that I think U.S. sanctions are doing nothing. I think they are having a tremendous effect in the deterrent and the de-risking elements and putting the pressure, as Cindy was saying, on Beijing and Beijing companies and financial institutions. I mean, what we're seeing in the market, again, despite the political rhetoric on the other side, is that China and its large institutions are very nervous about running afoul of U.S. sanctions and being put on the list next. And we're not seeing anybody going near Russia or really, big corporations going near Iran or anything like that. So I think I totally agree on the Taiwan front. I think China's very nervous seeing how the West reacted with Russia, and in general is very nervous about having its large corporates and institutions sanctioned. So even though the U.S. hasn't really done that yet, it's there, right? It's looming. And I think that's having a tremendous effect.
That's very interesting. And so just then thinking about if this is a more longer term strategy for China, do you think then that, Cindy, as part of that strategy, China would be in any way looking at the way in which the West imposed sanctions and ratcheted sanctions up against Russia, particularly over the last 14 months, and considering, okay, there's a blueprint there. What can we in China do in order to sort of insulate ourselves as much as possible from those particular measures? I noticed that they seem to be forming sort of stronger alliances. President Lula from Brazil was in China last week, and in fact he said, I thought it was quite interesting. He said something like, "Every night I ask myself why all the countries in the world base their trade on the US dollar." So obviously there are conversations going on about trying to make trade between these nations less reliant on the US dollar, which is of course a significant lever when it comes to considering US and international sanctions. So do you think China is looking at what happened in terms of the West's reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how coordinated it was, the measures that have been put in place, with a view to trying to insulate itself?
Yes, absolutely. And it's known that China has been looking at that. So as early as March and April last year, it's been reported that actually the government has been organizing for banks, private and state-owned, as well as various government departments to do stress tests to talk about what would happen if similar sanctions happen to your organization. What would you do about that? That effort we can expect has continued throughout the last year, although the results of that is obviously very closely guarded. And then in terms of, just how paranoid China is about all sorts of insecurities it has. I mean, China is now a net importer of food, of energy, and you can see that China is, trying to secure itself. Even sanctions aside, any American effort to increase hostilities in a sort of trade war, it's a good idea for China to be insulating itself a bit more. And in fact, it was the trade war with Trump that had China starting to talk about dual circulation, which is this idea that you have an internal circulation in China so that the Chinese would feed itself. Xi Jinping says that Chinese bowls should be filled mainly with Chinese grains. That's something that he cares about. But also like an external circulation where the world is still taking Chinese exports, but the Chinese themselves are not dependent on international imports. Now, that's easier said than done, but an effort is being made to do that. Hence, closer relations with Brazil, because Brazil is actually China's largest agricultural producer and overtook the US a couple of years ago. Hence closer relations with Russia too. This question about why China hasn't condemned Russia more, why hasn't China mediated, all of this sort of stuff. Well, China's actually getting a lot of cheap oil out of that. And that this is a kind of land-based energy supply, stuff that doesn't have to go through an Indo-Pacific that is largely controlled by American forces. So I think that's very much front of mind as well. And then in other areas like semiconductors that we've talked about, China's looking for self-sufficiency. You know, it is looking to win a tech arms race so that it wouldn't be at the behest of the West, united or not. So I think there are lots of things that it's considering. There's also one more point, which is the military consideration. The PLA is actually, a lot of it is based on Soviet experience. Lots of equipment is literally Soviet equipment. And that's why it does drills with the Russians even today, because the PLA actually is a bit of a on paper military. And what I mean by that is actually it hasn't conducted a military operation since 1979. So a lot of things have changed in China since 1979. And it will have looked at the Russian invasion to also learn militarily the lessons there, why the Russians weren't able to take Ukraine in the way that it had hoped. So lots of lessons to be learned, I think, for China from all of what that's happened in the last 14 months.
Perfect, thank you. Maya.
So just bringing David and Chloe back in, I suppose it's fair to say broadly that the West has been pretty united in relation to sanctions on Russia. Obviously, the EU countries have had significant differences of interest to resolve, but I think to perhaps a surprising extent have done so, particularly on energy issues so far. Do you see the same kind of unity between the US and the EU, Five Eyes countries and so on, if there were to be ramped up sanctions in relation to China? Or do you think that, for example, the EU countries are much less likely to follow the US lead on this one? And also just how prepared do you think the thinking is and the policy thinking in the US and elsewhere on this already?
Sure, you want me to take that first, Maya? I mean, I think in the China context, I think you're right. The cohesion in the West was surprising, I think, to most people, including those in the West, on how we got everybody on board, particularly the Europeans who, to be honest, shouldered a lot more of the burden, particularly on the energy side, right, than did the US. I think there's probably no question that becomes more challenging exponentially in the China context, given just how diverse the economic relationships are with China, how diverse the political thinking is. I think Cindy's right. There's a spectrum of thought, right? The Russian invasion in Ukraine was in Europe's front door, right, on their front lawn. That made it a lot easier, I think, to get Europeans on board. I think that's going to be harder a little bit in the Taiwan context. I don't think the U.S. will go it alone. I don't think they could. I think that would actually be much more disastrous for the U.S. If they tried to go it alone. And we've seen that they have a hard time doing that now, right? So the semiconductor controls are a prime example. Unless the U.S. could have got Japan and the Netherlands on board, really ultimately you end up short selling the U.S. Industry base, right, as others pick up the slack with China. So I think that will continue to be a problem if the U.S. is looking to ratchet up sanctions in China. Now, in the China context, if the U.S. is willing to sanction China and shoulder what I would think would be actually quite a significant economic and financial burden, the U.S. may be more prone to use what Michael rightly said is the lever of the US dollar to sort of force global financial institutions and its allies to play ball, right? And they can do that in a number of ways, including enforcing secondary sanctions and the like. So I think the US would continue to push allies to join. They may have to be a little more coercive than they'd like, and I think that will cause some friction. I think it would be a very difficult challenge.
Chloe, I don't know if you want to come in on what's been said so far. I mean, in particular, before we square back on a couple of more specifics, are there key things you think businesses and banks should be doing now to prepare for future China sanctions? Obviously, financial institutions with some exposure might be having to do so, but are there general lessons at the moment, or is it a sort of wait and see what will happen in the future?
I don't think anybody can take that approach now after what we've seen with Russia. I think Cindy said nobody expected the invasion to happen, but it did. And I think we all have to be very thoughtful in our thinking going forward with China, because the likelihood of it happening, whether it's high or low, could cause quite far-reaching economic pain on both sides. But I think we in financial sector certainly get the feeling that there is an advanced thinking across the G7 plus countries, in particular, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia, who wouldn't normally be sitting around the table discussing these sorts of issues in London or in Brussels or in Paris or indeed in DC, at the same tenacity that you would see that we've been seeing recently. So I think that advanced thinking is taking place and global positions are forming. What I would say is that in terms of what banks, what businesses can do and should be thinking about in preparation is a sort of warning. This is back to maybe 2014 and the same sort of warning signs that we got when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. Those sorts of warning signs are coming out. And so if you are going to do business with China, continue to do business with China, and indeed increase the business with China, you need to be very cautious because those warning signs have come out. I think the US are the ones that are speaking most significantly about this. But if the writing is on the wall, ultimately, whether it's a 3, 4, 5, 6 year delay, but you're looking at some of these vast projects where huge capital is being invested, then I think those warning signs are already out there. And whether or not it's a cautionary approach now or due diligence that needs to be increased over the coming years, that's what's being spoken about around the table.
Okay, I had another question for David and then one perhaps for Cindy. David, we've talked a bit about China's potential responses to sanctions. One of the things we've seen, of course, with Russia is the idea of counter sanctions. So putting laws in place to try to make unlawful or somehow counter the impact of the West sanctions. What impact do you think that China's anti-foreign sanctions laws so far, without getting too technical, have had, if any, on multinationals doing business in China?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, Maya. So, they've had an impact. Everybody, if you're doing business in China, you're operating in China or Hong Kong, you're talking about what does it mean? What are the risks under the AFSL, for instance, or the blocking statute or the unreliable entity list or any number of the recent tools that China's put in place, largely, if not solely, in response to Western sanctions, particularly US sanctions, right? So everybody's cognizant of the risks. Now, no one really quite knows yet how far Beijing is going to push some of these tools. And to date, they've been used very sparingly, particularly the AFSL. It's been used primarily to target politicians who are actually writing the sanctions or encouraging the US sanctions, and a couple of US defense companies that were selling arms to or engaged in arms trade with Taiwan. It hasn't to date been used to force an actual conflict of laws situation for companies operating in China or Hong Kong, even though it doesn't technically extend to Hong Kong. It has created conflict of risks, particularly political and reputational risks, that companies are being very careful now about language that they're using when they're complying or following their global policies or things like that in China. So it's changed a bit the tenor of, again, contracts, reps and warranties, compliance procedures, things like that. I still have not seen, and we have not seen, again, that in my view, that either US or Beijing is actually trying to force an actual conflict of laws such that, for instance, a bank would need to choose either complying with its foreign sanctions obligations or doing business in China and not running foul of the AFSL. And I think that's by design. It's very pragmatic. And I think both sides are getting political hits and political usage out of things like the AFSL. without really putting the screws in yet to commercial enterprises. But I think it's fair to say that you would be remiss to not consider the AFSL and other Chinese tools if you're operating in the region, and at least pay heed to the fact that they're there, and you need to be cognizant of.
Okay, well, one more from me to Cindy. We are weaving in some of the questions we've had in, but then I think, Michael, I don't know if we're going to throw some of this out to the audience in a moment. But Cindy, I just wondered what you thought about one of the issues that occurs to me and some of the audience is sort of other potential reasons why sanctions might be in place or ramped up in relation to China, other than in relation to Taiwan. So obviously, certainly from a UK perspective, but also elsewhere, there have been very significant prohibitions in relation to Huawei and the use of technology. In the UK, there have been people sanctioned in relation to the Uyghurs, the human rights situation, as you mentioned, in China. And what about if China takes steps, significant steps that are seen as supporting Russia in a pretty key way? We've also been asked if China's recent support for a UN resolution condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine indicates a bit of a change of dynamic in that respect or not. But what do you make of, in relation to sanctions in particular, these other dynamics feeding into the picture other than Taiwan?
Yeah, I think I see a pretty complicated picture of dividing between different purposes of sanctions, I guess. One is to control China's hard power. So when it comes to things like semiconductor industry, what the West is essentially doing with export controls and the CHIPS Act and similar is to hobble China's lead there, or any potential lead. So that's one reason to go down sanctions. Another is dependence and national security at home. National security is a phrase that's been really inflated in recent years, but I just mean national security at home. So Huawei comes into that. Do we really want to have Huawei equipment in our telecoms network? And then finally, an ethical dimension as well, as you mentioned, the Xinjiang issue. And that is something that, sanctions on Chinese officials that led to the counter sanctions on European officials, which included some, London law chambers and politicians, as you know. And so those three dimensions I see are the triggers for future sanctions. But, China doesn't take kindly to being sanctioned. And as we saw in the Xinjiang issue, they do tit for tat. So, whether or not any of these individual situations lead to more sanctions will actually depend on the case. And then also what China does in response will also depend on what the sanctions in the first place are. I think that question about the UN resolution is really interesting, because it also does come in the week after Zelensky and President Xi have spoken on the phone for the first time, since the invasion happened, at the highest level, really. So I think that it's too early to say, but I think we should be watching the space to see if China is mediating a little bit more. This idea that China is sending the peace envoy to Ukraine to help all the major players talk to each other. That's not happened yet, but it's going to happen, that they've announced. Voting against Russia in this resolution. Are we seeing starting signs of China kind of taking more of a mediating role? Be very, very interesting to see. I think it's too early to conclude just yet, but it certainly is a pattern that we should be keeping an eye on.
Could I just follow up on that for a second, Cindy, putting my rather sort of skeptical and cynical hat on for a moment? I mean, it seems to me as though that's one of the really interesting developments over the last few months. We've seen China play this sort of peacekeeping, mediating role between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're currently engaged in talks with the Taliban. We've seen this long phone call with President Zelensky. Do you think that China is trying to position itself as having a greater sphere of influence, as a peacemaker on some of the great conflicts on the planet? And specifically in relation to Ukraine, when China initially exhibited support for President Putin, that went down extremely badly in the West. And do you think that this initiative now is a way to try to dilute that and try to get the EU more on side, so that if there is something that happens further down the line in relation to Taiwan, there's more of a chance of creating a split in the West between the United States, the UK, and the EU?
So on your second question, I think it could be why, definitely could be why. And some people have pointed out that this comes in the aftermath of Macron's visit. So has Emmanuel Macron achieved something here? I think it's unlikely that Macron himself would have been the only reason that Xi picked up the phone to Zelensky. I think China has always been trying to perform this, what some people call a Beijing straddle when it comes to the war in Ukraine, trying to, on the one hand, saying it's not supporting Russia, it believes in sovereignty, whilst on the other hand, condemning NATO expansionism, American imperialism, talking about how that's sustaining the war rather than as if Ukrainian self-determination wasn't a good enough reason to keep fighting the war. And it wants to get both sides because of the economic situation at play here. Something that we've already hinted at here is just the incredible amount of trade between China and the EU and China and the US, especially compared to China and Russia. So it wants to keep straddling that position. I think this phone call, this resolution, it could be a way of diluting that, especially after the March visit to Moscow. But at the same time, I'm skeptical to say that that China cares that much about the West's opinion on this one. I was speaking to some officials from the Chinese embassy recently, and they were saying, when I put this to them, they were saying, but what do you mean the world is against China or Russia? Actually, it's the West that cares about this. What they meant by that was that the developing world was actually, a lot of the developing world was actually pro-Chinese stance on Russia, or even pro-Russia itself. So I think that's something that here in the Anglophone world in the West that we don't see as much, that China actually feels that it does have the weight of the world community behind it in a lot of the things that it does. Going back to that BRI question that we were talking about earlier. And then your first question about, taking this mediation role, I think it's really, really interesting what's happening in Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's the first time ever that China has taken its world power status and done something in terms of a political responsibility with it. The US is used to being a policeman of the world, which comes with its hard power. But for the longest time, it seemed like China wasn't interested in that part of being a world superpower. It was only interested in the hard power or the soft power in aid of its own interests. It wasn't interested in meddling in non-China related conflicts. So I think this Iran-Saudi Arabia deal is definitely a watershed. Whether or not it's the beginning of a pattern, I think we need to see more. I'm also very cynical when it comes to Chinese mediation. I think there's always, I think the Beijing authorities are very good at fulfilling Chinese interests and not meddling too much in ways that probably some Americans are envious of. So I think I would be skeptical to say that this is definitely going to be the new normal, but it is very, very interesting. And if we have more case studies, then that would be definitely a theme that's developing, but not yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just pick up on one of the questions that's come in and follow on from some of the comments that have been made? I just want to focus a little bit on the strength of the US dollar and how important that is when it comes to international sanctions. And from both Chloe and David's point of view, working with corporates or working with banks, in terms of international trade, the dollar, this time last year was just over 86% of international trade was done using the dollar. Now it's down to 84%. I know that's not a radical decline, but it's a decline nonetheless. The Chinese currency has more than doubled in terms of world trade, and that's not significant because it's gone from 2% to sort of 4.5%. But there does appear to be a direction of travel, and also a lot of these countries are now looking at their digital currencies and using alternative methods for trading with each other and using their own currencies, whether it's Russia and India or Russia and China. Do you see this as a potentially sort of a pattern that's going to be a sort of essentially going to see a long-term decline in the influence of the dollar, and that's going to impact on the US's ability to actually change the behaviors it wants to change using sanctions?
Yep, happy to jump in on that first, Michael. I mean, look, there's constant debate that the more the US uses the strength of its dollar, the more it's pushing folks to de-dollarize, right, and come up with other options. I think we've got a pretty long tail on that happening for a few reasons. It could at some point. I think I'll probably be able to ride out the rest of my career, at least fairly peacefully on that, because there's not really, the yuan is not in a position for a while to replace the dollar, certainly not as long as China has capital controls in place for one issue, right? I mean, that's just not going to happen. And there's not really another strong contender enough to pick up that significance of the global trade figures as one figure. So even if it drops to 60, 70, still the majority of trade is in US dollar, right? And it's really still the threat, even if you're not trading in US dollar directly, the threat that if you're a global financial institution, that the US will take away your access to dollars, you're going to play ball, right? Because even if only half of your business of your client's business is denominated in USD, that's pretty significant. So I think the dollar and crypto is interesting, certainly. I'm not sure how much crypto helps ultimately. I mean, it's very difficult to do big transactions in crypto, right? Big commercial transactions. The bulk of your large international trading is still not done that way. The US is getting more clever at getting to crypto companies. There's been 4 or 5 enforcement actions recently against crypto exchanges, for instance. So, I'm not sure that's quite the safe haven it used to be. So anyway, I think there's certainly a strong push. Russia's been trying, China's been trying to come up with creative ways to get around dollar and dollar clearing. I think they'll continue to do so. South Africa may join in, Iran may join in, Brazil may join in. So there's certainly that direction and momentum. I'm not sure when it's going to come to fruition. I don't think in the medium term.
Sure. Chloe?
Matt, just to add, I think I agree with all of David's points. They're well made. The long-term outlook is, as David has described, there is a shift, but it's going to be such a slow shift that I'm not sure it would happen in our lifetime. And I think one key indicator that I'm sort of aware of is the idea that we could have sanctions similar to those that we saw against the Russian banks and the Russian central bank against China. Would that actually cause a global financial crisis and a crash across the world? And I think, the idea that you could de-SWIFT Chinese banks because of the way that the dollar and the Chinese trade is spread globally is just unthinkable because of the strength of the dollar. And so we're not going to see those sorts of sanctions. And it may be that there are alternatives, like we've talked about crypto, but we've seen in the context of Russia that they're just not, they don't have the capabilities, they're not widespread enough, and there isn't enough trust in those alternatives for them to be able to overtake the dollar. So I really don't think it's going to have that sort of change that perhaps it's been talked about up until now. Okay,
that's incredibly helpful. We're running out of time, so maybe just time for one last question. So I've left a good one to the end. The one thing we haven't touched upon when it comes to considering risk in the short term, there is something that is going to happen in 2024, which may make a massive difference on all of our considerations. And of course, that's, according to the opinion polls, the presidential election between 2 elderly gentlemen in the United States. Now, I imagine if Joe Biden were to win, its policy as it is continuing. If he loses, and he loses to Donald Trump, we saw what Trump did with the JCPOA, insofar as Iran is concerned. Do you think your risk analysis changes at all? And if so, in what way? David or Chloe, do you want to take that one first?
Thanks a lot. Well, I could tell you my risk analysis changes if the Trump administration gets in, just because I will expect a little bit more chaos in the regulation, if you will. It's hard to tell. I think by and large we'd see very similar policies under either administration. I mean, I think we saw some straightening of some of the programs, if you will, when Biden came in, particularly the CMIC program, a little more clarity around what that meant. But by and large, right, most of the Trump administration policies were carried forward. So I'm not sure even there'd be much for Trump to unwind, even if he wanted to on the China policy. I suspect he'd find a way to make it his own, which any incoming president would do. But I guess the short answer is I gave up predicting what a Trump administration would do under the last administration. So I don't have an answer on that one. I punt.
Yeah, I think Trump has been described as an unguided missile, and Biden is capable of implementing strategic diplomacy. There was, as you pointed out, that review, the National Security Review, which looked at all of the sanctions measures and tidied up, including CIMIC and others. And I think that the sanctions measures have become a little bit more refined. You know what you're getting and what to look forward to, and the unpredictable policies of Trump could interfere with that. But does risk change? It's always going to be a challenge.
And Cindy, last word to you. In Beijing, who do you think they would rather see in the White House come the beginning of 2020?
I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because it was Trump who started, I would say, you know, this American turn against China. You know, there were structural reasons there too, but I think unless you had a president like Trump, you wouldn't necessarily have the speed with which hostilities increased. And yet Biden has kept those up. So he's kind of voting, he's got confidence in that kind of approach himself by keeping a lot of those strategic approaches. And then on the other hand, Trump, you know, he is just so haphazard, isn't he? I mean, he will go to international summits and tell Xi Jinping, I think what you're doing in Xinjiang is totally correct and good for you, you strong man. But at the same time, we know that there's a strain in the Trump caucus, at least in the last administration, like Steve Bannon, who always believed that China was a bigger threat than Russia. And so their isolationism on Russia, on the Middle East, doesn't actually necessarily mean isolationism on Taiwan and China. And actually a lot of it is seen, you know, withdrawing from Afghanistan or withdrawing from Ukraine, as Ron DeSantis has also talked about, is actually a way of getting closer to tackling the Chinese problem. So I think, you know, it depends really. I don't see that Trump would put any military resources into defending Taiwan if there were an invasion, and I think Beijing might think about that. At the same time, Trump would be happy to be much, much harsher on China pre and post that, just for the sake of American interests. So yes, a mixed bag.
Well, it's a question of watching this space. Well, can I thank you all very much indeed. David, Cindy, Chloe, Maya, my co-chair. It's been a hugely entertaining, interesting, fascinating, stimulating conversation. And we look forward to doing it again at some point very soon. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.